I would like to say that this picture I took of Professor Juan José López-Ibor in 2010 near the Dead Sea between Jordan and Israel tells a lot about the man. He was alone, looking at that sea, and probably in a very, very deep way, if I can say so. And it's one of the deepest seas of the region. Professor López-Ibor, Juan José, was a very dear friend. He was a brother to me. He was a mentor as well. I can say that he was one of the most knowledgeable psychiatrists in the world. He knew so many things about psychiatry. He was the perfect teacher, going from neurosciences to the most sophisticated psychotherapies. He was a most cultivated man. His knowledge of philosophy was outstanding, of other cultures also. And most of all, not only he knew everything about psychiatry, he knew a lot in culturally speaking, but he was also a very good man and a very ethical man. Just to tell you, I had many great moments with him. One was extremely important in my life, an extraordinary teaching. 2.5 months before he passed away, he insisted to come to Casablanca to teach the Moroccan residents from Marrakesh, Fez, Rabat, and Casablanca. He spent 3 full days teaching to these residents, 2.5 months before leaving. And not only that, he said, Driss, you have too little money with the Moroccan Association of Social Psychiatry. I will reimburse the plane ticket you sent me. This man was a true brother to me, and he will stay forever until the very end for me, and I'm sure for many others present here. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience on transcultural psychiatry. We have here Professor Müller, who participated to a book on history of the Department of Psychiatry, I think, of Munich. And there was this magnificent letter sent by Emil Kreplin to the administration telling them why he was going to Java in Indonesia. Because he said there are many differences in diagnosis and symptoms, psychiatric symptoms in different cultures. He stopped in Singapore, he went to Java, and said that there was a difference. Wolf and Sérieux, remember Sérieux and Capgras in French psychiatry about paranoia? In 1911, they were sent to Morocco, and they visited all the Maristans of the country to see how they were treating the mental patients. And that was also a kind of comparative study of how to manage mental disorders in Europe and in North Africa. Of course, it concerns symptoms and diagnosis, but also therapeutic approaches. The method is comparative, geographically speaking, but my message today will be that comparison must be made also from one historical moment to another. Moroccan psychiatry in early 70s. I started in 1970 as an intern, as a resident. And it was all asylum-based, as in many different parts of the world. Bereshit, for example, was the largest asylum of Morocco, and it had about 2,500 beds. Many of the patients were there for 30, 40 years. In Rabat, most psychiatrists were foreigners. That was the most important psychiatric department. Only 2 Moroccan psychiatrists for the whole country in 1971, and even in 1973, not more than 2 Moroccan psychiatrists for the whole country. And all the others came from various nationalities. I saw tens of patients in one room with intravenous insulin, with ECT without anesthesia. And that was quite a shock, especially that the wars, the place was not humane at all for these patients. And of course, French classification, we used to have bouffées délirantes aiguës, psychose hallucinatoire chronique, and others as diagnosis every day. What I saw at that time, that many hysterical fits between 5 and 15 every day, grande crise de Charcot. And that was kind of pseudo-epileptic seizure. Of course, these people were treated mostly by traditional healers. And when it didn't work, they brought them to the hospital. That was also a time of cannabis psychosis. We published a paper on that in 1973, saying that some psychoses are exclusively induced by cannabis. At that time, we believed in it. Then it went out of science, I would say, and it came back later on. And patients' files were minimal. 2 lines, not more than that, because the numbers were huge and the workforce was very little. And diagnosis of psychopathy was also very frequent for all those who were using drugs, but also violent and aggressive towards the others. In 1973, I went to St. Anne Hospital to be trained there until 1979, for 6 years. And I was trained with Pichot and Deniker. And of course, much nicer facilities, much bigger workforce, but the events of May 1968 were there. And Jean Delay had to quit, had to leave, forced to abandon his chair. And he was the man who discovered with Deniker chlorpromazine. And instead of one department of psychiatry in Paris, one in Strasbourg that was founded by the Germans some 1 century before, and one in Marseille in 1961, there was nothing else. And from one department of psychiatry in Paris, it became 11 departments, from one day to another. One thing was important going on. Psychiatrie du secteur, 2 things. Psychiatrie du secteur. That was kind of sectoral management of mental patients, geographical sectors. But also psychoanalysis that was hugely predominant at that time. I came back in 1979 and founded the Department of Psychiatry in Casablanca. It happened to me to see 72, 73 patients in one afternoon. I was the only psychiatrist in the public sector with one resident for 5 cities, for 4 cities and 5 million inhabitants. Casablanca, Mohammedia, El Jadida, and Ben Slimane. And we were on duty 24 hours over 24. Less than 10 psychiatrists for the whole country. In 1979, we were 18 million people. And facilities were in the most terrible state. I wrote to Professor Alfred Friedman in New York. He was a friend, and I was complaining. Said, I'm in hell. I mean, what do you think I could do? He said, Driss, don't worry. It was like that here 15 years ago in New York. That was extremely helpful. This comparative statement from a great man like Alfred Friedman. In the 80s, the shock of DSM-3, 1980. People working in psychiatry in Morocco with the French tradition said, what? Panic attacks, panic disorder, general anxiety disorder, what's this? No more anxiety, neurosis, and all these things? No. They had great difficulty with that. In Casablanca, we thought that it was extremely important to open up to WHO and to the WPA. And in 1982, we had the first, you remember that, Jorge Alberto, regional symposium of the WPA in Marrakesh. That was the name, that was 1982, that was given to the regional meetings of the WPA. And we started training psychiatrists on a larger scale, and I created in 1979 the League for Mental Health in order to inform people about psychiatry and mental health on the one hand, and on the other, to have money, funds to improve the daily life of the patients. Just to tell you, now the Department of Psychiatry of Casablanca, out of 104 beds existing, 100 were built by this association I created in 1979. In 1990, again, I'm in collaboration with media, community literacy in psychiatry and mental health was a very important move. And illiterate people coming to me saying, I have a depression. What do you mean by that? And they start telling all the symptoms of depression they feel. So this is something that made it an easy, it was a kind of opening up a door and a window to people about psychiatry and mental health. The very first WHO Collaborating Center in Morocco, all medical specialties included, was opened in 1992, and it was the one of Casablanca in psychiatry and mental health. And it is still the only one in clinical sciences. In the years 2000, there was an extraordinary moment that happened between 2003 and 2007. That was the National Epidemiological Survey on the Prevalence of Mental Disorders in the general population. On a representative sample, 5,600 people were interviewed in the whole of the country, and it was with the mini that was translated into Moroccan Arabic. And we found results that were very high. Almost 1 out of 2 having some kind of mental disturbance or disorder. And there was an interesting thing that happened. The Minister of Health went to the head of state saying, I have these figures, what shall I do with this? The only question that was asked by the king was, do you trust the people who did this study? And he said, yes, they did the right thing, methodologically speaking. And he said, please give the results to the media. And second, I'm giving you my auspices for this meeting. And the figures came as a shock to the entire population. How come? And we started explaining, for example, about physical somatic disorders the prevalence of hypertension in Morocco among adults is 32%. One illness, cardiovascular. We have, for example, about 30% of all adult population of Morocco being addicted to nicotine. Nicotine is an antidepressant that gives cancer. It's an MAO inhibitor. So explain, and of course, comparing with what happens elsewhere, like, for example, 52% of the total population in the US have a lifetime prevalence of mental disorders. So we explained, and it became the official figures accepted by everybody. That was a turning point. At the same time, 2006, 2007, creation of family associations in major cities, 5 or 6 of them, because they said, this is not only us, it's everywhere. There is no family without a mental patient, says the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Increase of resources by the Ministry of Health. I can tell you now that from 2007 to today, we have a multiplication of the budget of mental health by 10, 12 times, which is in the years 2010, creation of the Moroccan Association of Users of Psychiatry. As far as I know, and you can tell me, Tariq, it's the only one in North Africa and the Middle East. It is very important. We had recently, a few months ago, an operation called Karama, which means dignity in Arabic. There was a kind of place where 1,200 patients were located, 800 of them being chained. The Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Islamic Affairs and Habus, the Ministry of Interior, all of them worked together to chain all these patients and to take them in regular psychiatric units, hospitals, and so on and so forth. That was a very important moment that the Minister of Health, who says to the Parliament that he has 2 priorities. One is emergency medicine, and the second one is psychiatry and mental health. To use the word dignity for mental patients is something very important. And of course, there is a significant increase of psychiatric institutions. 2 days ago, on Saturday, the King opened 4 units in Casablanca. 1 for rehabilitation of mental patients. 1 to treat patients with addictive behaviors. And 2 others, 1 for, I think, dental medicine and hygiene, and 1 for chronic diseases. So out of 4, 2 are, that was the day before yesterday. And much higher presence of psychotherapy than before. This huge change from asylum psychiatry to a much more community-based psychiatry accompanied what is happening in Moroccan society. Urbanization. In 1956, we were 15% in cities. Now we are almost 70%. A better education. In 1966, we were 5,000 students in universities. Today, we have 500,000 students coming into university every year. Access to internet and social media, extremely important. About 40% of all Moroccans have direct access to internet. Decrease in size of families, emergence of individuals from community. That is very important. People who don't say anymore us, they say me, I. very important, individualization, and increasing importance of women and youngsters. This is very, 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 very important. We share between Spain and Morocco somebody called Averroes. 800 years, Ibn Rushd. 800 years. And he was, I would say, historically a good friend of mine and of Professor Juan José López-Ibor. He was a great philosopher. He said, if we are backward in our society, this is because half of society crushes the other half. That means men and women. And a woman who is educated, he said, can become a philosopher, hakim, or a wazir, which means minister, already 800 years ago, Averroes. Psychiatric consequences. We hardly see today conversions. And each time we say them, we see them, in fact, behind, there is a depression. Most of the time. Diagnosis of bipolar 1 and 2, much more present now, instead of schizophrenia. That was, notion of psychopathy almost disappeared. Many of them are bipolar 1, manic people with this kind of too energetic behavior, aggressive towards the others. And more guilt in depressions instead of persecution, because we had a huge number of persecutory depressions. And of course, more guilt means more suicides. Just to tell you a little bit, this study that has about 20 years ago, that was made about 20 years ago in my department. Just to tell you, we studied the files of 437 patients. And we categorized them in agitated depressions, delusional, persecutory, suicidal, and non-psychotic ones. And this is what we found in about 10 years or 15 years difference, 13 years difference. What we saw is that the suicidal went from 23 to 40%, almost doubled in 15 years. What we saw is that this delusional persecutory went down from 30 to 27. So every single day, I see much less of persecution and much more of guilt. And this happened in Europe as well, in Spain, in France, and elsewhere. So we are just following your path in the way society is moving, culturally speaking, ahead, changing, moving ahead, and the way symptoms of a number of mental disorders and diagnosis change as well. To conclude, of course, culture is different from one country to another, but it is different from one region to another in the same country. North, south, east, west, people are different. And sometimes from one neighborhood to another. Subcultures, very, very important. Culture evolves over time because of changes in society. Very, very important as well. I think this is my main message. I visited for the first time Spain in 1967. And I was accommodated in a place under the supervision of priests. Today it is very different. And women today in Spain or in Italy are not the same that 40 or 50 years ago. I mean, we have Rome has her first mayor, a woman, today. Very, very, in Morocco we have ministers who are women, female. We have pilots of planes, we have judges, we have professors. We have more professors of medicine who are females in Morocco than in France. This is a huge societal and cultural change. for every single psychiatrist, necessity of cultural sensitiveness is there. We must learn about cultures and their impact on symptoms and diagnosis, and treatment as well. We must be competent everywhere, because every single society is becoming more and more a mixture of cultures. And we have 65 million refugees this year in the world, 65 million. And this is why it's just next door in Marrakesh, next year, April 2017. We have this International Federation of Psychotherapy conference on the universal and the cultural in psychotherapy, because it is important for psychotherapeutic medication treatment, but also for psychotherapies as well. Thank you very much for your attention.